my... There it goes. For some reason, everything glitched out and dumped everything that I just said. There it goes. For some reason. That's awesome. Well, let's go back to the beginning.
Now let's discuss playing against straightforward, tight, passive players. So these players just have what they are representing. When they bet or raise, they usually have a strong premium made hand or a very strong draw that they're happy getting a lot of money in the pot with. When they play passively, when they check, or check and call, they usually have a marginal made hand or a marginal draw that they don't think is good enough to get their money in with. So against these players, when they are raising before the flop, you in turn should 3-bet less often, right? Unless, of course, they're going to fold to 3-bets too often. Against these players after the flop, you're going to want to value bet your strong marginal made hands and better made hands, and then fold if they raise you. So instead of betting with a polarized strategy in scenarios where you should be betting with a polarized strategy, when you don't have the range and nut advantage, you should be betting with a much more linear strategy after the flop, which is often going to be stuff like middle pair. Because when they check call your bet and you have a strong middle pair, they are probably in pretty bad shape. Certainly they could have some weak top pairs, but they're going to raise their best top pairs, right? So when they don't raise, it implies they don't have a premium hand. And it turns out like top pair bad kicker, middle pair good kicker can very conceivably value bet. You very often find these players playing in like weak cash games live or very small stakes tournaments live where, like I'm telling you, they could not play any more straightforward. They raise when they have top pair and better. They call all the marginal hands. They fold all the junk. Just as easy as that. Also, you want to make sure that you consider checking your strong marginal made hands if it'll be difficult to get called by worse. I think a lot of people take the previous comment I said about how you want to value bet a little bit thinly against these people with a linear range way too far, and they start value betting like all bottom pairs. And that's not the strategy against a straightforward tight passive player, because at the end of the day, these players are kind of tight. And they realize like bottom pair is not good if they face a flop and turn and river bet, especially if the bottom pair is generally weak. So don't be too insane when it comes to trying to exploit these players.
So there's a good adjustment here that I was going through when the thing, when this VOD crashed out, is that these are the kind of players where you're going to have a standard situation where you could go bet, 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 or you could bet for value, right? So this is one of those ones where you've raised pre-flop, and I'm thinking of 10 players that I play against currently at 10-L on WSOP, where if I was to bet the flop and they were to check call it, and there's no reasonable draw out there, they're not in a crazy early position, that kind of thing. With candidate hands where I would normally go bet, 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 where I wasn't pure bluffing, but I was protecting my hand and getting good value in a presumably strong spot. These aren't the players that going bet, bet, bet against is a good idea, because they are presumably tight. So when you make the first bet, they're already thinking, is my hand good enough to fade 3 streets of action? So typically I'll remove the 3 streets and usually bet the flop, and then when they check the turn, I'll check, and if they bet the river, usually these are the small bet guys on the river, so you can raise that reasonably and get value, or they check and you can bet and then they'll pay you off. But they won't call the same size bet on the turn as they will on the river, because they will be convinced that they're going to face a third barrel. So second pair might be good enough to bluff catch in their mind, but not good enough to take the heat of 3 streets, because they're not thinking that way. Whereas in contrast, there'd be other players in the same exact spot where I'm like, okay, I bet this hand fits the range that I'm in, I'm going bet, bet, bet. That's when you're using a polarized strategy based on your range and nut advantage and your positional advantage, versus a linear strategy, which we're talking about here, where you're kind of just going up against what they have. And the trick against beating these guys is getting more value than they get and paying off less when they get you. You know what I'm saying? So it's just important to realize the kinds of players you're up against in these scenarios.
Let's take a look at a few hand examples. Here we have ace 5 of hearts in the cutoff seat facing a raise from under the gun +1. This is a spot where you certainly can 3-bet, but this is a good example of a scenario where if you think this player is raising with a pretty good range to begin with, you don't really want to be 3-betting with many of your normal bluffing type hands. And for that reason, you should be way more inclined to call with suited aces, suited connectors, small and medium pairs than you normally would, right? You're always calling small and medium pairs, but sometimes the suited connectors and the suited aces get 3-bet. But not if your opponent is starting with a very strong range. Flop comes ace, king, 8. Opponent bets 300. You definitely can't fold top pair to 1-bet on the flop. It is a scenario where you pretty much have to call and just try to improve on the turn, or get to a situation where your opponent checks the turn. And
before he says it, this is also the kind of thing where he's not going to have a lot of flush draws, right? Because your opponent is going to start out as a tight passive player, which means tight players usually play more premium hands. They're from their position. He's in second position, at an 8-handed table. We're thinking high cards in here and all like that. So this is the kind of scenario where you can float your way into a good bluff here when a spade comes off, because you didn't 3-bet pre-flop. You can have literally anything. There's even players who will be observant enough to fold when the 10 or the jack or the queen comes off, thinking you may have a straight. But it's also one where if you make the 2-pair with ace-5, you do have to worry about it a bit, because they're always going to have you out-aced. So if they're putting on a ton of action, you kind of have to consider that you can't raise these. You may still have to call down depending on, if it comes off queen, jack, and they're still firing, it's probably just bad for you. Or if it comes off 5 jack or 5 queen especially, it's probably just bad for you and you should just get the hell out of there. But it's one of those interesting situations where your position here against these players is so important, because the main thing in here is passive. Passive players don't bet the bad hands. They don't, even though everybody knows to c-bet and all like that, and they will c-bet to a certain extent, these are the only players you are going to see at the very low levels that are going to check the flop, that aren't winners. I mean, you should be checking the flop as a balanced strategy most of the time, but tight passive players generally aren't winners because they're relying way too much on the deck. So when they check the flop, they're probably just telling you, meh, I don't have shit. Like they had like pocket 9s on this flop, or even something as bad as, I don't know, like a 10-9 or something, because they understand the dynamic of that hand. And you can just bet this flop and take it and, make sure you charge them for their draws.
An important point about a lot of these tight passive players is that they often will raise a normal range of hands pre-flop and continuation bet somewhat normally, maybe even too often. But then when they get to the turn, and especially the river, they typically play very straightforward.
Yeah, the turn is where these players really fall apart. My personal feeling is that the turn is where you're going to make some of your biggest bets throughout the hand. One, because you're going to be, if you do get called, you're going to have most of your chips in the pot. And two, because it's really where you define what's going on in the hand. At this point, in No Limit Hold'em in the current day and age, so many people know about c-betting flops that it has become damn near standard that your hand doesn't have any information to it until the turn. And this is true because you do get out all the little bullshitty hands, that you beat and all like that. But you also just crush so much of your action by just going with 100% c-bet. Like, I would love there to be a HUD on WSOP just for one day to see how high the c-bet amounts are. Like, you go to ACR in tournaments, where it's a much more valuable play, you're seeing 65, 70% c-bet. I tend to go higher because I like bet. I like putting the pressure on and all like that. But even mine doesn't hit 80%. I would imagine on WSOP, the average player on there, it's probably like 90+%. It's really insane how often these players abuse that. But then on the turn, they either bet too small because they realize they can't stop betting because it just looks too weak, or at least that's their mind, or they completely just play straightforward on the turn where they're just still betting when they have the best possible hands, reasonable nuts, or they're just giving up and just checking it.
There. So you often will have to play the turn somewhat normally, perhaps raising a little bit less with your draws, but you typically want to call top pairs in this spot. Opponent bets 800 on the turn. How do we feel about this?
Right, like this is that nightmare scenario where he's not slowing down, he's not passive, he's a passive player. He's just betting his hand for value. Now, in truth, can he have ace queen? Sure. But what are the ace queens that are left? Well, there's the suited ones, obviously, the clubs, and, hearts and diamonds. And you can give him all the ace queen combos, which now you beat. But the real problem is that there's just as much going on for ace king here. And if you take that suited ace queen of clubs into the mix, you're not going to have any idea if it's that or if it's ace king, or you're just totally crushed. Pocket eights is going to continue betting because this flush draw and straight draw is very dangerous. Kings, aces, this is not a player betting something without at least top pair. And when you have the hand that barely beats top pair, you know what I'm saying? That's what we're talking about here, because the best top pair right now is ace queen. Yes, you beat that at this moment, but there are so many more combinations that are likely of hands that actually have you crushed. This is really not a great scenario, and I'm very interested to see what Jonathan says.
Well, what are hands the opponent would like to be betting with that are premium? Will the opponent...
People often get into a thing of like, well, wait a minute, if you made two pair on the turn and just went ahead and folded, what was the point of calling the flop? Well, I'm calling the flop, and if this player had checked, and even if the 5 doesn't come off, I'm probably betting, because they're just, they've given up now, you know what I'm saying? And I obviously have the best hand. Maybe I can squeak out some value from them by betting small and looking like I have a draw or something like that. But when I hit my best possible card, which is the 5, not the ace, and the player continues to bet and bets strongly, I really can't love this scenario too much. I don't know if I'm folding it yet. It kind of depends player specific, but...
View ace queen, ace jack, ace 10 as premium. Some will, some won't. If they will, we probably want to get our money in immediately.
Right. If their tight version of a range is, ace Broadway, like he said, there's way more combinations that we beat, 10s and jacks. But a lot of these players, especially at the super low levels, 50 and L and under, won't consider even opening ace jack in second position unless it's suited. I mean, you're just talking about, nitty players that aren't true nits but are just undervaluing their hand, or overvaluing combinations of good aces and undervaluing everything else.
Unless they'll fold if we jam, which some type passive players will, because they'll look at this board and think, well, I only have ace jack, I guess I have to fold. Don't beat two pair, right? If they are bluffing with a draw, it's going to be a super good draw, like queen 10 of spades that has lots of outs, so that's not all that relevant. And if they have a better made hand, ace king, ace 8 suited, aces or kings, then we clearly don't want to get our money in. So this is going to sound really nitty, but I think the right play against most type passive players here is to call the turn and then call it off on safe rivers like a 9.
Right. Like, see this queen? Like I said, that's the worst card that can come off for you now. So
or lower, besides an 8. And then fold on the higher cards if the opponent jams. Because when the opponent jams here, you can be pretty sure a tight passive player has ace queen or better virtually every time. If the river was a 10 and they jammed, they probably have ace 10 or ace king. If the river was a jack, they probably have ace jack or ace king. And I get that this is super exploitable, both. We are making money in this scenario because we expect this player to not bluff often at all. So when they bet flop, bet turn, jam river on this type of board that runs off with a big card such that some of their perhaps overvalues with like ace queen, it's not really an overvalue, but you get what I'm saying. A hand like ace queen improves to beat us to the point that now we don't actually beat much of their value betting range. We have a very easy fold. I'm not looking to fold two pair very often, but when a tight passive player who only puts their money in with the nuts wants to put their money in the pot, you'd be pretty sure they have a very, very good hand. And in this scenario, ace 5 is essentially a good bluff catcher, and you don't want to catch bluffs as someone who doesn't bluff. So I do fold. This opponent did have pocket kings, and that's nice.
That's a real-world hand, by the way. You can't forget that. That's a real-world hand that played out, and the guy ended up showing him, probably because Jonathan showed the ace 5, and the guy, was a fan or something like that. But it's one of those things where you're in that situation, the strength of your hand is kind of determined by how they bet. And it's one of those things where, like he said, it's very exploitable. But the truth of the matter is these players, these type passive players, are not playing polarized exploitative poker. They're playing linear poker, meaning I have this, so I bet this. I mean, there is no guesswork. So yes, Can they get us off of a lot of good hands if they were to take the line that this guy thinks I'm tight and I'll fold everything? Action Dan Harrington. That's why he got the name Action, is because he was seen as the tightest player in the world at one point playing tournament poker, because he seemed to always show up with the nuts. The truth of it is, if you've learned from what Dan's written and seen his career, you realize that he wasn't the tightest player. He just was very selective with his moves. And he would do things like, instead of playing standard bluff lines, he would play bluff lines that looked like the nuts trying to get the money in. So he would get these people to put in so much money on the flop and turn and then just bomb the river, where it just looks like a really bad bet, and it's like a bet that nobody would make, and he gets the folds. And then when he does everything, that when he was doing everything in the standard method, he would just show up with aces. And it's just like, people called him Action Dan because they thought he was so fucking tight. And that shit didn't get exposed until TV Poker came out, and people were like, holy shit, what the fuck is Dan Harrington doing with 9-4? I mean, they would just like lose their mind seeing the genius of this man. And then all his books came out and he explained it, and like why he was doing what he was doing. But these aren't those players. This is not a player who's a genius like him, who's going to exploit you like that. That we're talking about a player in this player type that is just tight, is just passive, sees their cards, sees that they match or improve by the board, and then just goes ahead and bets for value. Very entitled players who believe that because you made a hand, you deserve to get paid. It's not true. There's more to it than that. These are also players that won't be bluffed too easily on pretty good strength hands. So in scenarios where you have a set, these are the players that you bust when they have top and bottom pair. But they're gonna check call you down, and you just gotta keep piling and don't let the monsters under the bed get in your head.
Let's take a look at same hand. Opponent raises, we're gonna call, same thing. They bet the flop, we call. Turns a 5, and they check. What does that mean? Well, now
we're looking at the scenario of the ace jack, ace 10, ace queen possibly, or strong draw. All these hands aren't going to fold. So for me, I think I'm betting somewhere in the neighborhood of the bet we were facing, somewhere around 2/3 pot, because now he's just told me his best possible hand is 1 pair, and when we have 2 pair, we beat that. This can be a scenario where he can have hands like king, queen of clubs. He can have hands like, any ace, 10, jack, or queen. Even hands as weak as the 8-9 of spades or something like that, or just like there's some weird combinations, even jack 10 or queen 10 of spades. More likely though clubs, because those hands that are betting flops like king queen and ace jack of clubs, these players will realize that their draw should have to come in, and if it is backdoor, they're going to get paid, but they don't want to get blown off it by a guy with a set, because if he was to bet 800 here and we were just to jam all in on him, he can still fold and have 27 blinds left, so it's kind of like a really sticky situation if you have the suited like ace jack or even queen 10 or something without too much showdown, king 10 as well of clubs. So for me, I'm betting here, basically just value and protection all the way, because I can be 99% sure that I'm good here, and I'm really only going to get called by draws, which means I'm going to have to be very aware of the river. Sometimes this is ace queen, not very often.
We have the best hand virtually every time, because if this player had a better hand than ours, they would definitely bet it. So that means they have either an ace that's going to call any reasonable bet, a king that may or may not call a reasonable bet, or a draw that's going to call any reasonable bet. So in this scenario, you want to be betting using a large size. You don't want to bet small. You want to bet big, because if the opponent has like pocket queens, they're just going to fold, right? So
This is that thing of, if they're only going to call you a certain percentage of the time and you have the best hand, bet bigger. That way the times they don't call you are paid off by the times they do. So like betting a 3rd pot here is useless, because the size of the bet doesn't matter unless it gets ridiculous. So you can actually go up to full pot here, I think, sometimes, and get the call from hands like ace jack, ace 10, ace queen, because you just called pre-flop. And these players do not like to be bluffed. Tight players wait a long time to play hands, and they kind of get sticky. So even though they're passive, they really, I think they get personally insulted when they think they're getting bluffed. You know, I get bluffed hundreds of times a day. I don't give a shit because I bluff hundreds of times a day, and it shouldn't matter. You know, it all evens out. But this is the kind of spot where I'm betting big, because if they're only going to call me 30% of the time, you know what I'm saying, I might as well get as much value as I can in those instances where they call.
We're trying to bet an amount that will get called. This is where it's important to consider the opponent's range connectivity. I know we haven't discussed turn play at all yet, but range connectivity here is very important, and what will call you. Whenever you're playing against players trying to exploit them, very often the question is, what do I want to happen, and how do I make it happen? Based on the opponent's range and strategy. And here, they're just not going to fold an ace. And they very easily could have an ace. They're not going to fold a king, and they very easily could have a king.
That question, asking yourself, what do I want to happen on this flop? I literally used to say it out loud. What do I want to happen next? And this is when I was playing fewer tables and all that kind of stuff. Now that question just goes off in my mind automatically playing 9 tables. What do I want to happen next? And the reason why asking that question is so important is because when you have the answer of what you want to happen next, like here, I want to bet big, get called, and get checked 2 on the river, bet big, and get called. That's my answer. If something different from that answer happens, like if I get check raised or he leads the river or something like that, it makes me have to stop and reevaluate the hand and realize something may have changed, or I may have been being trapped. It's a good spot where you end up spotting sets in situations like that.
And they're not going to fold a draw, and they could very easily have a draw. And if they have junk, they're always going to fold, so we don't care about the junk, right? And the thing is, if we let it go check here, thinking, oh, I want to check the turn and let them bluff the river with their junk, tight passive players don't bluff the river.
Nope.
So there's no point in letting it go check. So we want to bet using a big size here. I do bet 1,000, which I like a lot. Opponent calls, river's a queen, they check. Can we go for value? Well, will they call with ace jack or ace 10? If they will not call with ace jack or ace 10, we should actually check here.
Semi-player specific. This is one of those ones where it's kind of on the line, because you're going to get called by most likely, king, queen. Although I really don't know if that continues unless it was the king, queen of clubs specifically. Ace jack, ace 10, depends on the player. Some players just will not for the life of them fold an ace no matter what. And they think because you didn't 3-bet them pre-flop, they end up doing these mental gymnastics to talk themselves into calling you. So they're saying, oh, well, this guy can't have ace queen or ace king because he didn't 3-bet me pre-flop. And that's simply not true. I can have ace queen here all day long. But also sets. So they're really only looking to make hero folds and hero calls. So what's the hero call here? I think it's king, queen of clubs, really. I think that's it. I don't think there's any other hero calls that we beat. I don't know how tight exactly this player is, but when I classify tight passive, I don't see them calling with any other hands that I can beat other than simply ace jack. There's also a player who will check ace 8 now, like if they had the ace 8 of diamonds or something, and they made 2 pair on the flop, and then they're like, wait a minute, why am I getting called here? They might be afraid of the ace king or something or whatever. They might they kind of see monsters under the bed. That's why they're passive. So for me, most of the time, this is a check back, because we went, and this is the thing you always hear me say of, we're going to go for value and protection right now while my hand is good. I'm protecting against draws, and I'm getting all the value that I'm going to get right now if the board turns bad is the end of that sentence. So I think this is a check back most of the time against these players. And they're going to roll over and show you ace jack a lot, sure, but they're also going to show you a lot of hands that would never call, like king queen of spades and or queen 10 of spades or whatever.
If they will call with ace jack or ace 10 or ace 9 suited or ace 2 suited, etc.,
there's also a super wrinkle here where queens play very similarly to this, and so does jack 10 suited. Jack 10 suited in clubs or spades plays this exact same way, because you just bet huge on the turn. They have less than a pot size bet left. Your bet here is all in. That's the only bet you have. So you have to be damn sure that you're not getting trapped. And I honestly don't know. I've seen guys show up here with queens enough times to know that I should have checked.
As a lot of people will, a lot of people just don't fold top pair, then we should definitely make a bet. Question becomes, how much should we bet? we'll get into a little bit of deeper tournament theory here, but in general, if your opponent will fold to an all-in but will call a non-all-in bet,
That's true.
non-all-in bet that is still kind of big is usually ideal because it will result in them calling virtually every time, whereas if you go all-in, they may start finding folds. So that is what I do in this scenario, and I like this play against a tight passive player because you will find a lot of tight passive players, when they face an all-in, they get scared. They think, oh, well, my ace-9 doesn't really beat a lot. I guess I have to fold, even though it does beat all the busted draws. The opponent doesn't.
That's a good point. This is the bad bluff sizing that I talk about, where it's half pot, where most players are value betting either less or more, and this is the bad bluff size. And I don't know if players consciously realize this, but it is a thing. So this is when in tournaments I'll talk about, I'm going to use the bad bluff size to get called here, and that gets called quite often. Obviously, if we get raised, we're just screwed. I mean, it sucks to fold and only have 9 blinds left, but it's better man out.
Know or care about that. But in this scenario, I definitely like a smaller than all-in bet, unless the opponent's just a bit of a calling station, or they think you're insane and they're going to call with any ace. Opponent does call, and we win. And notice they just had ace-10, right? Solid bluff catcher.
Picked up that draw on the turn, like I said. Didn't want to bet themselves off the possibility of the backdoor nuts. That made the most sense to me.
Let's take a look at this hand. 9-8 suited. We raise it up. Big blind calls. We flop top pair. We're definitely going to bet the flop. They call, so we still have the best hand very frequently. They check the turn, and here we have to ask, what are we trying to get called by? Very important question. What are we trying to get called by, and will it actually call if we bet? We're trying to get called by a hand worse than 9-8. The opponent probably doesn't even have all that many hands worse than 9-8, unless it's a hand like 7-6 suited or ace-6 suited. They could have small pairs. A lot of the tight passive players don't even call backdoor flush draws on the flop, so that means the jack is pretty much a blank. But if we bet, will they call with worse? And I think the answer is very often, no, they won't. Then you have to ask, should we bet for protection? Meaning, like, say the opponent does have 6-5, and they would fold to a turn bet, but they're only going to put money in the pot on the river if they improve, then we probably should just go ahead and bet and win the pot. We should bet small here, right? So this is a spot where if we do bet, we definitely want to bet on the small side. If we are going to let it go check, though, and the river's an uncoordinated card, we should probably go for a river value bet. This time we do let it go check. River's not an uncoordinated card. This is a spot where I think some people get a little bit carried away thinking, well, they probably don't have a jack and they probably don't have a king, so I should value bet because I have the best hand. The thing is, though, against the tight passive players, they are not going to call here with like 6-5. They're just going to fold every time. So there's no point in value betting. If the river was something like a 2 or a 3 or...
2, not so much, because any card that pairs an undercard on the board, the 6 or the deuce, I don't like it. I love a jack, honestly. Even an 8 can be a problem here because of 7-5 being, problematic, but I think your worst cards here are 6s and deuces, honestly. But you could just be getting called by the, king. Somebody could have, whatever. I mean, they could even have hands as, that have paired on you as weak as, Jack 10 or something like that. Like, people will see hands like straights more so than backdoor flushes. So, like, a hand like, the ace 4 of hearts should be calling this flop a lot of the times because of backdoor straight and flush draws. But players don't go for that. Maybe 10-7 is where they come in because they have the gut shot. You know what I mean?
A jack, then I think there is merit in betting small, because then if the river is kind of a blank, your opponent may find hero calls with pocket 7s, a 6, maybe even ace high for all I know if they decide to be a little bit call happy. But whenever the river is an ace, king, or queen, and really even a 10 is pretty bad. In that scenario, you probably want to tighten up and just not go for the thin value bet. So this time it does go check. We beat pocket 4s, but this is a hand that would not have put money in the pot on the river, even if we value bet, and I like this play. So against these tight passive players, it's very important that you listen to what they are telling you. When they raise you, when they want to put all their money in, they have something very good. So if you can't beat the hands that are very good, you have to have the discipline to fold. And when they show weakness, the pot's yours. All you have to do then is just bet and claim it, unless they're calling stationing, and we'll discuss those type of players in a minute.
My first pick on it was the best worst hand that I could beat, which was pocket 8s. But this makes perfect sense. I mean, there's even merit to backdoor straight draws here with pocket fours. And you're going to see these a lot, especially in tournament poker. You got to remember, this is a tournament masterclass. So, players are just going to see you, raising. And I think the first thing that most bad players go to is the guy has ace king. You know what I'm saying? And then if you bet this turn, believe it or not, you'll change their mind. And you'll be like, oh, well, he has ace jack. You know what I'm saying? Like, because people just discount the C bet. Like, it just not. If I have ace king on this board, on this flop, I'm not betting. Most of the time, I'm not betting because the big blind's defending range is going to have a shitload more 9-6s and deuces than my hand is. But that's also why this hand becomes a good value candidate, because I'm not supposed to have the 9. You know what I'm saying? Now, if I have 10s or something like that, yeah, we can, pocket pairs, we can go from there. But you're talking about board improvement. The big blind should be improved more by this board than I am. And when that's the case and I have ace king, I'm just going to check because I have the best unimproved hand. You know what I'm saying? At that moment, I have the nut low high. So it's just an interesting thing to go out of. And there's some hands that you only get one street of value on just because of board run out. The board killed your action. I mean, if the turn had come off, anything 9 or lower, you can bet again. And believe it or not, you get called when a 9 comes off here. And it's interesting. You actually get an extra street. Against tight, passive players, should you fold more often to their pre-flop 3-bets? True. Because they're tight. They got better hands. They're not bluffing as much. When a tight passive player plays passively, what are the main types of hand in their range? Select all that apply. Well, passively would be their marginal hands and marginal draws. I guess junk too, right? Yeah. Marginal made hands, marginal draws, and jumps are the most common things because it is linear. They're not going to play passively with their premium hands and their premium draws. They're just going to bet those. And when we say, like, premium draws, we mean draws that they don't mind getting the money in with. You know what I'm saying? I find these players to be... I used to be one of these guys where you'd see players who would bust out of a tournament in some... interesting fashion, and if they just told you what hand they had, you'd be like, what the fuck? But if they explained the hand, you'd go, oh yeah. You know what I'm saying? Like, having 10-8 suited in a 3-bet pot or something like that, and and you'd go, what the fuck? And then you'd be like, yeah, but I flopped the open-ended straight flush draw, and we got all the money in on the flop. These are players who kind of stress averse. Personally, I do well under certain, in-game stress. I actually like very much putting pressure on, getting that little flutter when I'm bluffing, stuff like that. I like that kind of thing. It's a little sadistic, but it's just the way my brain looks at things. I also enjoy confrontation in my everyday life. Like, I have funny stories every time I go to Walmart and somebody fucks around, and I like getting in people's faces. It's fun for me. And I've realized that about myself. I used to say, like, what's wrong with me? Like, do I have a sign on my forehead that, says, please fuck with me? And it's like, no, it's because I enjoy it. And I don't look for problems, but I definitely like getting in the way of them. It's just something that's fun for me. So that means that my style is more aggressive, and it's more polarized, and it's more knowledge and fact based. You know what I'm saying? When a tight passive player plays passively, what are the main hand types in their range? I got that answer so wrong. Well, this is what I'm talking about. They're tight, so they're already starting out with good cards, right? And good hands. Now, that's based on position and things like that. Yeah, no delay, man. Yeah, these are wake up with me streams. We don't delay in this because we're just learning. This is what I do in the morning, is I'll either review the hands from the night before, or I'll study something. And we've been going through Jonathan Little's tournament masterclass from the site that I play from, or that I pay for, pretty much every day. You're seeing this is like, what, number 87? We're like 30 episodes into this tournament masterclass. So it's a long form study that I've been trying to get through but not rush it. And we're not even 20% of the way through this thing. It's probably going to take till the summer to get all the way through this tournament masterclass, honestly. But yeah, no delay in the morning, man. You can ask me anything you want, completely off topic, whatever. It's also, I like to also connect with everybody on these streams because I do have to have delays, playing poker. I have to have a delay. But yeah, So the concept there, you're starting out with somebody who already has a range advantage on the deck. You know what I'm saying? They're starting with good hands. So, but they're passive. What that denotes is that they're linear, meaning they're not using polarized betting strategy like I am. They're not sitting there going, okay, in my position and this board versus the players I'm playing with my stack depth and my current image, I should bet here and they should fold to me, and you watch people crumble. They don't do that. They're sitting there going, I have ace king. And then they raise, and then the flop comes down with an ace on it. Ooh, I got an ace. And then they bet. And then, the turn comes off, and it's fine for them. And they're like, okay, that turn's good. And then they bet. It's linear. It's based on the strength of their hand. So when they're not playing passively, they have premium made hands, and they have premium draws. No fault draws, like that open-ended straight flush draw, where you can go, what are you going to do? Well, what you can do is not be a fucking idiot and get 80 blinds in on a draw. That's what you can do. But these players don't see it that way. There's a bit of gamble to them too. They just want the responsibility of going out of the tournament lifted from their shoulders. They want to be able to sleep at night. Maybe it's a better way to live. I mean, hands keep me up at night. But it's not how I want to take my poker career. I enjoy the stress and the agony of it. So when they're playing passively, they just raised, they have king queen or something, and the flop comes off, ace 4-3. Well, they'll just check. They're just passively playing because they don't have anything. They're looking at the cards going, that doesn't help that, so I'm done. I check. And then you just steal these pots all day long when you just had some speculative, garbage in position. Important to have position on players like this. More so than others, I think, because they give up too frequently. And it's very exploitable. So, yeah. So if you have any questions along the way, man, just type it in right away. Because no problem. It's no delay. So we're going to mark this section complete. And we're going to go on to the next example of player. This is exploitative adjustments for different player types on the flop. That's what this section we're talking about is. And it's, let me see if I can find the thumbnail. If you're looking for the first part of this section, here we go. Where is the thumbnail? This is it. I mark all the different sections. This is the exploitative adjustments on the flop section. This is the whatchamacallit, the current thumbnail. So if you see this on YouTube and go, oh, what was the part 1 to it? You can see it's this. It's, me as the mech droids fixing the wing of Padme's ship in episode 2 or 1. No, it was episode 1. That's where they met R2D2 right there. So okay, so now this adjustment is versus straightforward, so still playing their hands, right? The value of their hands, but loose and passive players. These are players who are going to flop a lot. They're going to have a lot of suited connectors. They're going to have a lot of pairs, but they're not going to go for the bluff.
Now let's discuss playing against straightforward, loose, passive players, okay? These players get to the flop with a wide range because they play a lot of hands, right? They're loose. But a lot of that range is going to end up being junk on the flop. So, kind of like against straightforward, tight passive players, you're going to want to value bet with your best made hands and your marginal made hands, and you're going to want to fold the marginal made hands if you get raised. So you're going to be betting with a much more linear strategy against these players. You should also strongly consider betting with everything in basically every scenario against these players, because if they get to the flop with way too much junk, you can easily exploit them by betting with a wide range and forcing them to fold out the majority of their junk.
For me, I categorize players as loose by their general amount of hands that they're playing, which would be loose here. They're not tight. Their general approach, passive, would be this guy's general approach, and then their overall style. Straightforward being that. So straightforward, loose, passive for me is kind of reversed, because if the player is loose, like he said, if they're loose, they're playing so many hands, statistically they're not going to hit a lot of flops versus how many hands they hit. I hit, a proportional amount of flops based on my position that it makes sense, because I used a polarized strategy. These players are playing more linear, so their hands have to be improved for them to bet. These are the players that you'll see, making small raises or even limping in tournaments and then checking flops. And it's like even in position, like these are players who will, 3-bet or call on the button, with a 4-way pot, get it checked to them and not take a shot ever unless they've improved. And against these guys, it's very easy to play because, you just value bet and they're going to call you with draws so you can value bet a little bit bigger. And they're just going to raise you with everything good. So you just get a get out of jail free card right away. And you can just throw it away knowing that you have to beat at least like 2 pair usually on average is my standard. Those are the ones where you'll see me fold aces on the flop like, well, this sucks. And just give them up, but got away very cheaply. Because they are passive. And we're talking about a straightforward player, they must be improved by their hand. If the player's tricky, that's different. Loose, tricky players are your standard, everybody calls them California Asians because they raise a lot of hands and they make a lot of bluffs and they know blockers and they take things away from you. They're loose, tricky, loose, aggressive players. I'm saying? Much different scenario.
Essentially, these players are going to have a difficult time defending anywhere near the minimum defense frequency. So let's say in a scenario you're supposed to check fold like, 40% of the time out of position or 50% of the time out of position. I'm sorry. Yeah, if you defend the big blind, maybe you're supposed to fold a decent chunk there. These players may end up folding out like 70% of the time because they're only going to have a good hand roughly 30% of the time.
Because they're showing up with more hands that are weaker. That's why they can't defend to the minimum defense frequency. If you start out with the right defensive range, which they're not doing, then you can defend at the minimum defense frequency. If you expand that range, you have to fold more often because your range is not connecting with the board as much as it should statistically.
Right? Which means they're going to substantially overfold in these scenarios, which makes betting with any 2 cards profitable. Also, if it's clear your opponent's going to fold a lot, you should strongly consider slow playing more often because you really, really, really want to keep them in the pot. So let's take a look at a few examples here. We have the 9-8 suited. We open it up. Loose passive player call.
9-8 suited, by the way, perfect kind of hand you want against this type of player. Like, I think I'd actually prefer it to ace-king suited just because when our range is improved, their range is going to be improved as well. Sometimes that works out bad for us, but being a more educated player versus a more passive, looser player, when it's better for me, I'm going to get it all. When it's better for them, I'm not going to give it all up. So these are the kind of hands I love against these kind of players.
In the big blind, and we have this flop. So this is a flop where we certainly should not continuation bet 100% of the time normally, but against this type of loose passive player, we can certainly bet because they're going to have a lot of junk. They're going to have a lot of undercards that have little to no equity. They're going to have a lot of like ace high type hands that probably will just fold immediately or fold to additional pressure. So while this hand may be a hand that we would typically check because it really is just really bad straight draw, right? Really bad backdoor draw. I think it's a very fine bet using a small size against someone who folds too often or whose range is too weak. So we do go for a small continuation bet because we're betting with our entire range. We turn a gut shot, opponent checks. Again, keep betting. This is the type of player who's going to fold everything besides a king by the river. And I'm about to show you a little trick to get people to fold almost everything by the river besides 2 pair. Here we bet the turn, 500, opponent calls, as they will do with any king, queen, or 6. We get to the river, river's a 10, we have nothing. They check. This is a spot where we are going to go all in. Because a lot of these players will not call it off unless they have 2 pair or better, and it's pretty hard to have 2 pair or better in this exact scenario. Sometimes they will, but more often than not they won't. So we're going to go for a 1.5x river overbet. We're going to be discussing river strategy a lot more later, so I realize this may be a little bit advanced right now, but we're going to discuss how to balance your range if you want to play a fundamentally sound strategy, and also how to exploit players who make, folds with the vast majority of their range. This time the opponent does fold, and we move on to the next hand.
The reason why it's important to go bet there is because those will be scenarios also where you'll have like second pair, like queen, jack or something, and the player may actually have you beat, but they will not be able to take the heat on it because they were on some other draw. So they might have been on a flush draw that now made, a king, you know what I'm saying? But they can't continue. So this section here clarified a lot of the reasons why you want to triple barrel sometimes. And versus loose passive players, it's perfect to do because you're expecting to get called quite often down to the river, but you must be able to pull the trigger for that river bet. And like you said, sometimes it's all in for 1.5x pot. It seems crazy, but sometimes it won't work for less. Because while they're loose and passive, like I said, passive players don't like to get bluffed. You know what I'm saying? Like, because it's more so the tight guys, but even the loose guys, like the high of their life is catching a bluff with second or third pair. So do not make that easy for them.
Here we have king, queen of spades. We open it up. Cut off loose passive player calls. We bet the flop with our strong top pair. Here I do think you have to be a little bit cautious betting with everything. And an interesting exploit against the loose passive players is to just bet bigger with your better hands, because if they have anything decent, they're going to call, and they don't really care how much you bet. So we do make this bet. We would probably bet any top pair in this scenario, whereas against a better player, we would check some of our top pairs, because this type of player is going to call with all sorts of stuff on the flop, like straight draws and perhaps even under pairs, and maybe backdoor ace high and whatnot. So our opponent does call. Turns a 4 of clubs, which is pretty bad for us. This is a pretty nice spot to check against a loose but passive player, because if we do check and our opponent checks behind, we have the best hand virtually every time. But if we bet and get called or raised, it actually starts to get a little bit close here, because the board just got way worse, right? So given the board got way worse, we cannot be overly aggressive in this scenario. And right here, king-queen is a very good marginal made hand, right? So the question is, will our opponent call with lots of substantially weaker hands, like Jack-10 no club? If they'll call Jack-10 no club...
I mean, you also have to understand that even hands as strong as like ace-king with the ace of clubs here, you really still can't bet. I mean, even though you have all those outs, because you can absolutely need the flush, and it's also a scenario where a player with 2 pair will bet and then pay off a river bet. Believe it or not, like the 4th club hits out and they have king 3 or king 4 or something like that, and the club hits the river, and after check calling this turn, leading the river will get these players to pay off, because I said there's an element of hero to them.
You probably want to go ahead and bet. That said, I think you're going to get very clear information out of a lot of these loose passive players. And if we do check and they bet, you can still reasonably call the turn and see what develops on the river. This time it goes check, check, though. Now we have the best hand virtually every time. So unless the river is a club or perhaps an ace or a 10, all of those cards line up pretty nicely with their reasonable kings and jacks. We are going to be going for a river value bet. Do not be afraid to get value from players who call too often. Again, bet a size that can reasonably get called by a king or a jack. I think 1,000 is a nice bet size. Opponent does call, and we win. This is actually a hand maybe they call a turn bet and a river jam with, or a river big bet, by the way. So maybe we left a little bit of money on the table this time. That said, you don't know what they have, right? Loose passive player raises, we call. We're going to be calling all of our good, strong, big suited hands here, just trying to flop very well. King, jack, 4, all clubs. Check, check to me. This is a spot where we're going to want to bet for value / protection. I understand if we get check raised here, it is miserably bad, but we're not going to get check raised here all that often. So this is a spot where it is perfectly fine to bet with the intention of folding if we get raised. And if we get called, we're going to be in pretty good shape. Now, though, a loose and passive player raises. So when a loose and passive player raises, the passive here is very important. That usually means they have a very strong hand or a very strong draw. So what's a very strong...
And they don't have to have the exact nuts. They can have, the king jack with the, they can have king jack, or they can have pocket 4s, ace king with the ace of clubs, king queen with the king of clubs, believe it or not, or with the queen of clubs, believe it or not. Also ace jack with the ace of clubs. All the hands that would rather just get the money in while they're good, or have the most equity. So you'll see people do this a lot with sets too. Like, they don't have to have a flush to do this. So if you ever see this happen and you have the suited ace here and you have the nuts, realize you're up against a set, and the move is to pile the money in and do it quickly, because you would be amazed how many times players will, in this pot, check raise you and then get jammed on, not have anything close to the nuts, but not be able to fold hands even as weak as 2-pair here.
Strong hand on this board. Well, flushes, sets, 2 pairs, right? We're in bad shape against that. What's a strong draw on this board? The ace of clubs, right? And ace of clubs wins 40% of the time or more, depending on what additional outs it has against me. So the opponent's either going to win 40% of the time when they have a draw, or they're going to win, I don't know, 70, 80, 90% of the time when they have the nuts. So this is a spot where you must be disciplined and fold. Remember, when your opponents are passive, as they often will be in the smaller stakes games, when they take aggressive lines, you have to get out of the way. This is actually a reason a lot of small and medium stakes players crush the small and medium stakes games, but actually struggle as they move up to higher stakes games, because in the higher stakes games, you're going to run into passive players way less often. You're going to start running into players who are willing to battle way more at the higher stakes games. Even the bad players in the high stakes games tend to be more aggressive. So recognize who you're playing against, recognize what...
Plus, those players don't pay you off. When you're up against players like this, it's, you can... The only merit to exploiting them is the fact that you don't pay them off. They pay you off. You know what I'm saying? Like, when you have good value here and you bet and they call, and then turn comes off and it's a red card and you bet and they call, and then the river comes off and they check and you check and just take it down with top pair versus their draw, you know what I'm saying? Then that is far exceedingly better than when they check raise you and kill the action. And they got one bet out of you as you're getting multiple streets out of them in situations where you're best. That's the difference. That's how you beat these players, is by getting value when you're best and not giving it to them when they're best.
The player pool generally does, but I would definitely say in the small and medium stakes games, most of your opponents are either going to be tight passive or loose passive, and if they're, at least most of your bad opponents, and if they are on the passive side, when they apply aggression, the very clear exploit is to substantially overfold.
Yeah, that's the thing. And there's some players that it's gotten to the point where I'm like, this player plays so bad and I've folded to them like 9 fucking times. You have to just realize sometimes players just get hands. And you can't sit there changing what you're doing because you think, oh, they're exploiting me. Nobody has that and like that. I'm thinking of an exact instance from 3 days ago playing cash against this one player who, it was like 5 times in a row we had a very similar scenario, and 5 times in a row he had check raised me. And on the 5th one, I was like, that's kind of, it's kind of seeming a little, and it was on the same table, and it was almost the same positions. And I was like, this is seeming kind of suspect now. But I had to default, and I kept rereading my notes, and I just realized this player is not a good player. He's just linear. He's telling me what he's doing. Why am I arguing with that? And I let it go. And as an aside, I ended up beating him for quite a lot that night because of this. But it was never in a scenario where he check raised. It was only a scenario where I made the bet and he called. And it was like, for me, if someone had the nuts against me several times and I responded by folding to them, in my mind, I would remember that betting pattern. And then the next time when I didn't have a good hand, but I knew that this guy was prone to taking shots or bluffing and all like that, I would use that betting pattern to make them fold because of what they know about me. Now, when they change what they're doing, and obviously they have a hand, it's going to change what I'm doing. But these players don't think that way. They're linear. They're passive. So they're literally going by what the cards say. And if you remember that, you won't sit there thinking, oh, they're bluffing me, they're exploiting me, and like that. No, they're not. No, they're not. They're just bad. All right, let's do the quiz. You should value bet loose passive players more thinly than typical players because they are unlikely to check raise, bluff, and they will call too often. I would say that's true. Yeah, they'll fold often or that you should value bet thinly and then fold if you face aggression. That's what we're talking about here. But when they call, they're just on draws being passive. Or second pair, maybe a weak top pair kind of hand. Don't want to get bluffed, but don't know how to defend that. Due to playing a lot of pots, which hand types are loose passive players more likely to have in their range? Well, junk. They're more likely to have junk. When you play most of the deck is not improved by the board. So you're going to have more junk than anything. So you can always bet small on the flop often as a bluff because that's a frequency thing. If they're not likely to be improved by this because it's literally like a player who's playing every hand, well, you can bet every flop because they're not going to be improved by that flop and they don't know how to defend against this tactic. So you just bet, but you can just bet small so that, you win like pot after pot after pot. And then when you make the bet and they raise you just go, oh, you got it. And you just give it to them and they got one small bet back from you. Meanwhile, you took 5 full pots from them. You know what I'm saying? Like, so it's very important to recognize sometimes, the jabs work better than the uppercuts. Sometimes you can just jab them and jab them and jab them and they'll just keep backing up, backing up, backing up and you'll win all the pots. But when they try to come back and, swing at you, you need to duck and get the fuck out of the way. That's the best way I can put it. All right, let's mark this as complete. We're going to see how long the next section is. Been going kind of about an hour now. Usually that's about how long I want to study, but if the next section is fast, then we'll go through it. Calling stations, yeah. Well, I guess it's short. All right, let's go for it.
Now let's discuss playing against calling stations. These are players who call far too often. They don't like folding. Also, you're going to find that most people who call too often don't actually raise all that often. So generally, this is going to be someone who is loose and passive, but does not fold very often by the river. So against these players, you're going to want to bet with your marginal made hands, your premium made hands, and your strong draws. So instead of betting in most spots where you're polarized, your premium made hands and draws, you're also going to bet lots of your marginal made hands. You're not going to bet your weakest marginal made hands like, marginal ace high, but you are going to be betting stuff like middle pair and better for sure, and maybe even stuff like bottom pair. With everything else though, your junky draws, you're going to just want to check because these players are passive. They're not going to bet the turn in the river and make you fold out hands with equity. They're just going to let you.
So many times been in these situations where doing this exact same thing against players and then checking all the junk and all the shitty draws, and then the shitty draw comes in. And you just start betting, and you can't believe that they're calling you. Like you've just made the weird gut shot, or you've just made bottom 2 pair, and you make this huge bet on the turn, huge bet on the river, and you get called. And for like a millisecond, when they call the river, you're like, really? And then they just roll over like 3rd pair, and you're like, whoa. Like, so we're talking about true calling stations.
You see the showdown and let you realize your equity. So you want to be betting when you are the favorite and checking when you're not. Seems pretty easy, right? It actually is. So understand that some calling stations may call pre-flop and on the flop and on the turn wide, but they may fold almost everything to a substantial river bet. So keep that in mind. That would be sort of like that example I showed against a loose passive player where we bet the flop, bet the turn, and then overbet the river. That certainly could be a viable strategy against some calling stations, because you have to realize if they're going to call the flop and the turn wide, they're going to get to the river with a lot of junk. If they get to the river with a lot of junk, then, well, you think they're really calling the river with king high and ace high and bottom pair? Some people do, some people don't. Depends on your particular calling station, right? Also, against calling stations, because they call too often, you're going to want to at least consider using larger bet sizes when you're betting for value, which should be most of the time. So now we're not really betting big when we're polarized. We're betting big when we have a hand that has our opponent's calling range in bad shape because we know they're going to call far too often, right? We are
and big can mean 80% pot or more. Anything pretty much up to the size of the pot can be considered a big bet without being an overbet to get called.
Maximally exploiting these players. All right, let's take a look at a few examples. We have ace-10 suited on the button.
So you can see, much different scenario here. I wanted the 9-8 suited versus the loose, passive, straightforward player. Versus a calling station, I want more premium cards. So the higher the 2 cards are, the more suited they are, the more connected they are, the better. So suited ace Broadway, perfect all day long. We want against this player.
Raise.
Because when we connect, it doesn't matter that if they connect, they beat our range, because this player calls so widely. They're going to call with all draws, meaning all gut shots. They're going to call with all, pairs, 10s and 5s. We beat all those. Yeah, they're going to call with jacks too, but then again, they're only going to have a jack here about a third of the time. And with no re-raising pre-flop, it's not a great jack, so we can actually, force them off by that river bet. So These are the scenarios that you want versus calling stations.
They call. This is, I can already tell you, we're going to be betting flop, turn, and river unless the board gets very bad. Because even though they could have a jack, they're going to have a whole lot of weaker tens, and they're going to have a whole lot of fives, and they're going to have a whole lot of gut shots and open-ended straight draws.
I love when I explain the thing and then he says the exact same thing.
So we are sizing up a little bit, 300 into 500. We could certainly even bet bigger, like 400. I wouldn't hate it. On the turn, we bet again. On the turn, I do want to make it clear that we probably don't want to size up too big here, because as you start betting really big, even the most call-happy calling stations are going to realize that you probably like your hand and you're trying to get stacks in.
It's the difference between betting like a third pot on the flop and then 2/3 on the turn versus betting 80% pot like he did and then betting now 2/3 on the turn. Same percentage on the turn, and the pot is larger, but because it's a calling station, we can overcharge the flop. But we don't want to bet like 1,000 on the turn, because that bet is going to be so huge and so out of proportion, like the flop bet was. And it's not like, here's the thing: if there's $10 in the pot and you bet $8, well, people just look at it and go, it's $8. But after they call that, now there's 26 on the turn and you bet 25, that number being so much higher doesn't matter if it was the same percentage. Now you're getting into numbers versus percentage, and those things catch these players' eye because they're not thinking about it in terms of percentage of the pot, because they're calling stations. They don't care about pot odds. They don't care about their, actual equity in the hand. That's how they make their calls. I make my calls based on, am I getting the right price? These people don't care if they're getting the right price, but they will care if they get charged too much actual numbers. So you can exploit them by overcharging all reasonable draws that they have, but still getting them to call, making them make a mistake they don't know that they're making. You know what I'm saying? Like if they need 30%, if they need 3-1 on the pot and you charge them, 2-1, and they call it, that's a massive win. But if you charge them 1-1, where it's a full pot and they fold, it's a massive loss, because they're not going to make that mistake because it's so blatant and over the top.
And if they think you're trying to get stacks in, they are going to start playing a little bit tightly. Notice here that we could be beat. I think a lot of people get in their minds that they don't want to value bet when they could be beat. But remember, this opponent's calling with all sorts of nonsense. So if they're going to call with all sorts of nonsense, even though we lose to jacks sometimes when they have it, well, every time they have it, you want to be value betting because you beat all the tens and you beat all the fives, and that should be a large chunk of their range.
And the question is, what jacks can take heat? You know what I'm saying? Like, can Jack 9 take heat on this river? Probably not. I mean, because we're going to jam this river.
River's an 8.
It's not a great
think
card.
About it.
It's not a great card.
Here? I know we haven't discussed river strategy yet, but it's always good to test yourself.
Like the gut shots of Queen 9 got there, 7-9 got there, 6-7 got there, and believe it or not, 6-7 will be there with these kind of players. So it's not the greatest card in the world. These are brain teasers, because the initial plan being bet, 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 it's very easy to talk yourself out of it. But the question is that you really have to ask is, are we up against the jack more often, or are we up against something that we can beat more often? Or something that can beat us more often that got there. Now, is this player checking the straight? Usually not, but they are calling stations, and even the worst of players will realize they just nutted the river with Queen 9 or 7-9, like Queen 9 of hearts or something, and those players will check and expect you to just blast off into them, because changing the script of check, call, bet is so abrasive that I think even bad players realize that they can't do it and get paid off. Really bad players do it anyway. So it's kind of tough. I think you're going to have to, if this is a live read, it's going to be much easier. I think timing would make a big factor here for me. If the player took a long time and then checked, I'm probably just going to check it back and take the win. If they insta-checked, I'm probably going to pile. If they took a reasonable amount of time and then checked, I'm probably going to just check. So this is one where I might need a little bit of help. That being said, I do believe there are more missed draws than draws that got there. So as a standard answer on paper, probably going to pile this one.
A little. In this scenario, I think we have a pretty nice value bet using a small size. If we bet too big here, like all in for a little bit more than pot, or even like 2,000, I think we're going to get our opponents to fold out most.
I did not consider that. I did not consider the fact of getting called or raised when we're beat, because they're not going to raise a jack, right? They're only going to raise straights, two pairs, weird sets like a 4 or an 8, something like that. So they're not going to raise us with a jack. So I guess value betting here is the move. So what's the value bet? Half pot? That's about 20 or 1,200. I think that's reasonable because nobody's piling it with king jack after they check call, we bet. Like they're not looking at bet sizing, like I said. So that's something I didn't consider. You could actually bet this. This is maybe a leak in my game in tournament poker where I know I'm up against the calling station, but it gets into my head of how bad is this player that he's actually going to call me. Now in a live tournament scenario, I think I am much more prone to bet, get called, and expect to be good here than I am online because the players are just generally better online. But that's a good point. I think betting the river for about 1,000 or 1,200 will be just fine here because king 10 will call. And, you know, even hands as bad as the ace 8 of hearts will call because they're going to just put us on ace king or something. Yeah.
Hands worse than ours, or at least that's a reasonable idea, right? Like if someone's sitting here with 6-5, you really think they're going to call if you bet almost all their money? Probably not, right? But if you bet something like 1,000, I do think you're going to get called a large chunk of the time, and that is exactly what I do here. We do get called by the bottom pair, right? Yeah. This is a spot where normally you may not even bet the flop with this hand.
The dynamic nature of this hand is because he has king 5. These players tend to, calling stations, bad players in general, tend to put you on ace king when you're the raiser pre-flop. Don't know why. It just became very common about 10 years ago, and it hasn't let up. So when they have a king and they've hit their second card, as long as an ace doesn't come out, they're going to be just fine calling you for, calling you down. The interesting part is when an ace does come off, or when a king does come off and you have the ace king in here, it's good to recognize that you shouldn't, like if the king hit this turn, I don't know if I'm betting because I'm no longer bluffing. Now I'm trying to bluff catch. And there's a lot of hands that could beat me if it's jack 10, 5, king. You know what I'm saying? So that's one of those scenarios where you don't pay them as much as they pay you. He's paying us here when we don't have the ace king. We're not paying him when we do have the ace king. We're not going to give him as much.
But if you do bet the flop with this hand, you would definitely check the turn. And, you'd probably put in a small river bet. But notice by betting the flop and the turn and the river, we end up winning 20 big blinds from our opponent. Whereas if we instead checked back the turn, we would have had a substantially more difficult time getting this much value. So make sure you value bet thin. Again,
a good concept that I don't think enough players consider is the fact that when you raise pre-flop and you're in position and you get checked to, your value hands are not just top pair. Your value hands are anything pretty much improved by this board. Because you still have the lead. Now, if you bet and get raised, obviously the script has changed. But it's one of those things where people will check the flop with that second pair and then bet it on the turn and not understand why these players didn't fold the draw. Like you didn't charge them. You know what I'm saying? Like they only have to call one street. So I think it's an important thing to remember that, your value hands only need to be improved by the board, really. Meaning even if the board is bad for everybody and you have aces or something, or whatever it is.
Against these calling stations. Is this the same hand? Maybe. Ooh, same up until the turn. The opponent check raises all in.
Yikes.
How do we feel about this one? Well, at this point, we have a very easy fold. We were betting for thin value, but we got raised. When you get raised by a calling station.
Another big problem people have is like, oh, this guy's super passive. He only calls us like that, blah, blah, blah. Then the script changes something like this where, you're now facing aggression. This is that part of Sun Tzu's book that I was talking about, The Art of War. If you push your spear and it hits flesh, continue. If you push your spear and it hits metal, retreat. That's what this is. This is hitting metal. This is now, doesn't matter what we're doing, we have to be able to beat 2 pair or better. Probably better. You know, Jack 10, probably top 2 pair. 5-4 also. 5-4 will freak out like this, not realizing how often it's ahead here. Because what hands reasonably do I beat if they have 5-4? I have Jacks and 10s. Yeah, that's cool. But what's the point of getting all the money in now? Am I really supposed to call this with aces? I don't think so. Maybe aces, but definitely not kings or queens. You know, there's just too many combinations of things left in the deck that fuck me. But this is a bad play you'll see by bad players who calling stations become aggressive because they don't want to get drawn out on. They think it's like the worst thing in the world. It's not. It's going to happen all day, every day.
Like I said, they're usually passive. If they're usually passive and they're raising you, you must have the discipline to get out of the way. Do not pay off the calling stations whenever they want to put their money in the pot.
2 pair.
One more ace-10 hand. Okay, this time we're going to be in position. Opponent raises. This is a nice spot to call and try to flop well. We could 3-bet wider in position against a calling station if they're going to call with lots of stuff. A solid exploit against calling stations is to 3-bet very linearly, just 3-betting with absolutely the best hands, and ace-10 suited certainly falls in that category. Calling's fine too, though. Whatever. Doesn't really matter all that much. Opponent bets. We have an easy call. Opponent checks turn. Now, we have the best hand the majority of the time, and I definitely think betting is viable. This is a spot where, would I bet turn and river?
If I'm only betting turn, I'm betting it big. If I'm betting turn and river, I'm probably betting it small. So my default here is probably going to be to bet half to 2/3 pot on the turn and then half pot on the river. Or go for full pot now. You know, which actually works out to be less, but sometimes you only get the 1 street call because you're up against a draw. And then when the river comes off, they're not going to call you anyway. So if I made the choice to bet half or 2/3 pot and they're not going to call the river anyway, then I lost money. If they're only going to call me with a draw, I have to get as much money as I can in now while my hand is good. And if they make the mistake to call and the draw misses on the river, well, I'm not going to attempt a bluff, you know.
It's close, but probably. I think it's very likely the opponent has a bad king or queens or jacks, but they could also have 9s, 8s, 7s, etc. So when I'm betting here, I don't think we want to go too big, because if we start going too big, that may result in 9s, 8s, 7s folding by the river. But I think if we go small, the opponent's going to call with any pair on the turn for sure. If they raise this here, by the way, and fold. And
so there was 1,200 in the pot. He bet 500, so a little under half pot, about 40%. So it's an interesting exploit. Maybe it's a live play thing, but it's interesting because it's kind of linearly betting the value of our hand versus the perceived value, not trying to ever set up a bluff on the river, which I guess is the move versus calling stations, right? Like if they have, you know, Jack 10 or something, or Queen 10 or whatever, or some kind of draw, like maybe that's the move. We're talking about a value scenario, so I guess our hand has less value, so we go for less value because they're going to have typically weaker hands that can call us and lose. So that makes sense.
And on the river, I think we can get in a value bet unless the board's very, or the river's very bad. And this is a very bad river. Can we justify value betting here? This would be thin. We would need our opponent to call with all sorts of junk to justify us betting in this spot, because now if they did have Queen Jack or Jack 10 or Ace Jack or Ace Queen, right? If they had any of those hands, they now beat us. Yeah. So I don't think we can bet on this river because this river is just awful. But if this was a lower river, like 9, 8, 7, probably even a 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, any of those cards, I would have gone for the value bet. This time the opponent had King Queen, though, so good thing we got saved by the river. But this is going to happen sometimes. Don't think that just because your opponent has a wide range that you are going to win every time. A lot of people get frustrated whenever they make thin value bets and they turn out to be, I'll call it wrong. But understand that your calling station opponent makes the mistake of calling with too much junk. However, sometimes they're going to have good hands, and when they do, that's okay. You're going to lose some pots. It is okay to lose pots in poker. Don't make that result in you being afraid of putting money in the pot when you're a substantial favorite. Because in this spot, if we get a blank on the river, we probably win this pot like 80 or 90% of the time. A lot. And not value betting using a small size in this scenario leaves a lot of money on the table against a calling station.
Interesting. All right, let's do the quiz. Are calling stations typically overly aggressive or passive? Well, they're typically passive. They're calling. Aggression is betting. Should you bluff these players more often or less often? Well, less often. You know, they're going to call you too much. If they're calling too much, you want to bluff them less, man. That's the story of it. We're going to mark this as complete. I believe the next section is the last section. If we can finish it up today, that's great. Hopefully it's not too long. But I'm just going to be playing cash today, so I got all the time in the world.
Now let's discuss.
This is a long section. 9 minutes versus a maniacal, loose, aggressive player. It's going to take a minute. I think, you know what? As much as I want to finish up the section, I think I'm going to let it go, and maybe I'll come back tonight and finish it on one of the streams. I don't like to overload myself, and when I once I saw the word maniacal, it's like, okay, now we have to expand our thinking way too much. There's going to be way too much explanation. This little 9-minute video is probably going to take us 30 to 45 minutes to get through. I can just tell by the content. So I'm going to leave it here, and let's go back to the lesson just to make sure I'm right that this was the last section. Although it doesn't matter. I'm not continuing anyway. Appreciate you guys coming out. I know we don't get too many on these, but hey, man, the people who do the work win the money. So take pride in that. And all these Wake Up With Me's with all these sections are on YouTube. We started working the Tournament Masterclass, I want to say somewhere around episode 40 or 50, somewhere in there. It's the first one where you start seeing me making thumbnails. The first one is me like this. Whenever you see this is the thing you need to know. Whenever you see this in a thumbnail, Tournament Masterclass, this picture will be somewhere in the thumbnail. In the current thumbnail, you can see it's right here. That will be somewhere in the thumbnail. That'll let you know that we're working on the Tournament Masterclass. I did that right from the very start when I started making the Tournament Masterclass stuff. So you can go back and track back to that and catch all the way up on this lesson. And as you can see, we only have one more part of this section remaining, but I'll show you here. I think there's some people who didn't know how dense this was. I see a couple of new people. Come on. Come on, come on, come on. They're working on my internet. Tomorrow it's probably going to be out intermittently, so I don't know how much I'm going to be able to stream, so I'm definitely going to be streaming a lot today. Just because they've got a service announcement, and they're going to cut our cable even for 4 hours at night, so who knows. So it started here, right? But if we go to, this is the Introduction to Fundamentals, this is the pre-flop strategy, and then we're currently on flop strategy. And I titled them like that. You can see this one's titled, episode 87, flop strategy. So we're in this flop strategy session or section. And then we're up to here. Currently it's exploitative adjustments. This is part 2 because it's the second episode I've met. So it's flop strategy, exploitative adjustments. Boom, just this section. When we get into the next one, it'll be flop strategy, playing multi-way. Boom. Then flop strategy, playing limped pots. Boom. All that stuff. Probably going to group a bunch of those together. But, yeah. So you can follow right along. Stay with us. I really appreciate you guys coming out. I'm going to go ahead and throw you to a host. And just stick around. It's a fun host. I always like to, when I'm on Twitch, unless I'm playing, I'm usually having somebody fun on the side. So have a great day. I'll see you guys in a little bit. I'm going to come back and play cash. And, yeah. So, thanks for coming out. Appreciate you.